Ancient Egypt, 1300 BC. For 400 years, the Hebrews have been slaves to Egypt. Egypt's statues, cities, and glory, all of it, were built by the Hebrews. In all the time that they have been suffering under the hands of the Egyptians, they have never forgotten their homeland, and have always prayed to get back home. Just like they never forgot their homeland, the Hebrews never forgot their God either. And God has not forgotten them. The opening scene of the film sees a man named Moses sitting among the generals in Memphis, the palace of the Pharaoh. A meeting was taking place regarding the Hittite army, which was camping outside Kadesh. Worried about the Hittite army attacking the palace, the Pharaoh, Seti I, told the generals to huddle together as he told them what to do. Afterward, Seti consulted the high priestess, who then divined a prophecy from the entrails of a bird. The high priestess then states that the victor in the preemptive attack against the Hittite army is unclear, but from what she has divined, a leader will be saved during the battle, and the savior of said leader will someday lead. Moses laughed it off, as he did not really believe in omens. Seti drinks the blood of the bird and prays to the gods for a victory against the Hittite army. Before they go into battle, Seti opens a box that contains 2 swords with scabbards that are made of gold and ivory. Seti gave the prince, Ramesses, and Moses each other's swords as a symbol that Moses and Ramesses, who grew up close as real brothers, would keep each other safe no matter what. Moses and Ramesses then set out with their army to fight against the Hittites. They attacked the Hittite army suddenly, taking them by surprise, but it wasn't long before the Hittites started putting on a fight. Moses bravely fought against the Hittites. Meanwhile, the chariot Ramesses was on got destroyed by the Hittites, and he fell to the ground. Just as Ramesses was about to get trampled on by an incoming Hittite chariot, Moses saved him by throwing a spear at the chariot's wheel, causing it to flip over. Because of what happened, Ramesses was frozen in place. Seeing as Ramesses wasn't in the state to fight anymore, Moses ordered everyone to fall back and take Ramesses home. The Pharaoh learned of what occurred in the battle, and he admitted to Moses that he did not trust Ramesses, his own son, to lead. During another meeting, the Pharaoh ordered Ramesses to go to Pithom, a place where the Hebrew slaves were working. Ramesses is to meet with the viceroy, look around Pithom, and make a report. Later that night, Moses approached Ramesses and offered to go to Pithom in Ramesses' stead. Knowing that the prince doesn't like the idea of going to the slaves' places as it is beneath him. The next day, Moses went to Pithom and talked with the viceroy. Moses is upset that while the slaves are miserable, the viceroy is living too lavishly. Moses decides to talk with the elders of the slaves. He asked the elders about the God they believed in, believing that the Hebrews' belief in God would someday make them revolt against the Pharaoh. Moses asked Nun, one of the elders, to come near him and ask him for his name. Moses then told Nun his own name before allowing the elders to leave. After looking around Pithom, Moses moved to go back to the viceroy when he was approached by one of the slaves, who told him that the elder wanted to meet with Moses in the prayer house. Moses went back to the viceroy and told him to stop living like a king. That night, he went to the prayer house and met up with the elder Nun, who told Moses that he was a Hebrew. There was an edict from Memphis to kill all the first sons of the Hebrews. To save Moses, his parents handed him to his sister, who put him in a basket and took him to the river banks. His sister let him float towards the part of the river where she knew Bithiah, Pharaoh Paramesses' daughter, bathed. Bithiah adopted Moses and treated him like her own. Moses refused to believe what Nun told him and left. Unbeknownst to him, 2 of the slaves who were there in the prayer house that night were actually traitors, and reported what they learned about Moses to the viceroy. When Moses returned to Memphis, he saw the Pharaoh lying weakly in bed with several physicians in the room. Seti ordered everyone in the room to leave except for Moses and Ramesses, who stood back, silently watching them. Moses sat beside Seti and held his hand until the Pharaoh took his last breath. After the death of Seti I, Ramesses became the next Pharaoh, and Moses became his chief advisor. The viceroy visited Memphis to talk with Ramesses. Moses tried to get the viceroy escorted away, but Ramesses let the viceroy in and ordered everyone, including Moses, to leave. That's when Ramesses learned that Moses was a Hebrew. That night, while he was eating, he was approached by Moses. Ramesses told Moses about what the viceroy told him, and the 2 of them just laughed it off. But Ramesses was already having doubts, so he summoned Bithiah, Moses' mother, and Miriam, Moses' sister. He asked Miriam if Moses really was a Hebrew, and when Miriam refused to answer, Ramesses swung his sword to cut off her arm, but Moses blocked it. Despite not believing that he was one, Moses still forcibly admitted that he was a Hebrew to protect Miriam. Because of this, Ramesses, who was forlorn about his new discovery, exiled Moses and sent him into the desert. Ramesses' mother, Tuya, wanted Ramesses to kill Moses as she had always wanted to be rid of Moses, but Ramesses refused, stating that Mason would die anyway once he got exiled, as there was just no way of surviving out there in the desert alone. Before he officially became an exile, Moses requested to talk to his mother and sister for the last time. Bithia revealed that Moses is indeed a Hebrew, and Miriam gave Moses the ring he was wearing when he was still an infant. Afterward, Moses began traveling through the desert with nothing but a horse to ride on. One day, while he was resting, he noticed a sword hidden inside the saddle. He was confused as he took it and realized it was the other sword gifted to him by Seti. Moses continued traveling through the desert until his horse died days later, as it had nothing to eat or drink. While he was sleeping beside his dead horse, 2 assassins came to execute him, but Moses killed them instead. He then took their belongings as well as their horses. Moses traveled once more until he came upon multiple people gathering around a well. There he met Zipporah, who took him to Midian, where he stayed for a while. Moses and Zipporah fell in love with each other and married. 9 years later, Moses and Zipporah now have a child they named Gershom. As the two of them were bonding together, Gershom told his father about Mount Sinai, which is known to be God's mountain. Moses, who had a different belief from Zipporah, has always found it funny how the Hebrews and his wife seem to be so convinced that God is real. Later that night, a few sheep escaped and went up the mountains. Moses started climbing after them while it was raining heavily. Suddenly, a landslide occurred, and Moses fell unconscious as he got buried deep in the mud with only his face visible. When he woke up, he witnessed the occurrence of the burning bush, wherein the bush was on fire but was not burning up at all. Then God showed up in front of Moses in the form of a young boy called Malak. Through Malak, God tells Moses that he wants him to be a general who will fight against Ramesses to protect the Hebrews and lead them to Canaan. After their talk, Malak suddenly disappeared, and Moses was taken back to his home to recover. Due to what happened on Mount Sinai, Moses seemed to have gotten into a panic. He told Zipporah about what happened, but Zipporah thought that Moses was just hallucinating because of what happened to him. Unbeknownst to Zipporah, Moses wasn't just hallucinating, that was him starting to believe that God was really real. Once he was well rested, Moses decided to go to Pithom to see the Hebrews. Zipporah and Gershom were unhappy about this decision of his but couldn't do anything but let him leave. When Moses reached Pithom, he was maddened at the sight of the Hebrews suffering even more than they did 9 years ago. Moses visited Ramesses, and discovered that Ramesses was the one who bundled Moses' sword in the latter's saddle before he got expelled from Memphis. It was so Moses can protect himself from the assassins that Tuya sent to kill Moses. Moses then told Ramesses to either give rights to the Hebrews or set them free. Moses decided to just leave when Ramesses refused to do so. The next day, Ramesses sent out an order to kill Moses and his family, and whoever Hebrew refuses to confess where Moses was, would be sentenced to death in front of the other Hebrews. However, the Hebrews did not falter. On the contrary, they only grew angrier every time a new Hebrew family got hanged to death. Moses trained the Hebrews in Egypt and instructed them to prepare weapons for their rebellion against the Pharaoh. The Hebrews targeted the Egyptians. They stole the Egyptians' food, burned down the boats, caused fire in the city, and more. Moses planned this so the Egyptians would demand the Pharaoh cast the Hebrews out, and the Pharaoh is most likely to listen to the demands of his Egyptian people. But God didn't like Moses' method, as it would take him years to save the Hebrews from the Egyptians and lead them to Canaan. So God told Moses to just watch in the meantime as he unleashed the 10 plagues. In the first plague, crocodiles have begun to thrash around wildly, murdering people and smearing the water with their blood. Every body of water in Egypt, including ponds, canals, streams, and the Nile River, turned to blood, killing all the fish and leaving behind a foul odor. In the second plague, due to the foul water, frogs left the river and went to land, entering houses and covering the ground with their little bodies. In the third plague, the frogs have also died. Due to all the dead fish and frogs, the city became infested with maggots and gnats, tormenting everyone in the land of Egypt. In the fourth plague, the city was still swarming with flies and swarms. Because of this, the Egyptians became infected with a skin disease. In the fifth plague, the Egyptians' livestock, the horses, donkeys, cattle, camels, oxen, and sheep, started dying. In the sixth plague, boils started breaking out in sores on every human in the land of Egypt. In the seventh plague, the whole city was struck by a strong hailstorm. The 8 plagues, after the hailstorm, the land was covered with locusts. In the ninth plague, darkness loomed over the whole land for 3 days. All these 9 plagues tormented the Egyptians, and instead of giving up, Ramesses even threatened God by declaring himself a god. God heard his threat and decided to unleash the 10th plague. Moses told the Hebrews to paint their doorways with the blood of a sacrificial goat to save themselves from the 10th plague. The 10th plague was unleashed, darkness engulfed the whole city and killed all the firstborns of the Egyptians, including Ramesses, who was devastated because of his son's death. When it was all over, Ramesses and his troops went to where the Hebrews were. Ramesses was angry at Moses' God for killing the children, but Moses told him that no Hebrew child died during the 10th plague. In disbelief, Ramesses told the Hebrews to leave Egypt. Unbeknownst to the Hebrews, Ramesses was planning on pursuing and slaughtering all of them. When he learned of the Egyptians pursuing them, Moses decided to take the route to the mountains to make it harder for Ramesses to get to them. He asked God for guidance, but God wasn't answering him. The Hebrews reached a dead end when they stopped in front of the sea. That night, Moses apologized for not trusting God and rebuked him. Moses threw his sword into the ocean and tried to go to sleep, but something was bothering him, so he looked towards the sea. The next day, he noticed his sword sticking out of the water. He took it and realized that the tide was so low that they would be able to cross the sea now. He ordered everyone to prepare themselves, as they were going to cross the sea. The Hebrews refused as the current was strong, but Moses assured them that they would not be afraid as God was with them. The Hebrews hurried to gather their things and started forming groups. They started crossing the sea as the water kept decreasing the more they walked. Meanwhile, Ramesses still rode his horses and chariots to the mountain, which caused a lot of his men to fall to their deaths, resulting in a landslide. Later on, they reached the sea and saw the Hebrews crossing it. The Hebrews saw the Egyptians, and Moses told them to run towards the land. The Hebrews did as they were told, while Moses and some of his brethren stayed behind. Ramesses' army screamed as they rushed towards the Hebrews, but seeing the ocean drawing nearer and nearer to them, Ramesses' men started falling back, and only Ramesses was left going after the Hebrews. Moses told his brethren to go without him as he urged his horse to run towards Ramesses. The Hebrews finally got on land, and the parted sea finally closed, drowning the Egyptian army. Both Moses and Ramesses survived, but while Moses was met with his people, Ramesses was met with the sight of his dead army. It was only then that Ramesses accepted defeat. Moses took the Hebrews to Midian, where he reunited with his family. Later that night, while the Hebrews were celebrating, Moses went up Mount Sinai, the God's mountain, where he was told by God to carve out the 10 Commandments on 2 stone slabs. The ending scene of the film sees the now older Moses riding on a carriage with the 2 stone slabs where the 10 Commandments were written. He sees God's young son walking alongside the Hebrews on their journey to Canaan.